In the middle of his own murder trial, Pastor Marcus Wright leaned over and whispered a depraved joke about the death of his victim, Ella Foster, directly into a live courtroom microphone for the whole world to hear. He was a man cloaked in the robes of faith and shielded by immense wealth, utterly convinced that his holy image made him untouchable by mortal laws. But he could never have predicted that his entire empire of lies would be brought crashing down by his most trusted friend, a disgruntled accomplice armed with a secret recording that would expose the true monster behind the pulpit. The city of Northwood prided itself on its quiet, tree-lined streets and its unshakable sense of community, a tranquility largely credited to the charismatic leadership of Pastor Marcus Wright. His megachurch, the Sanctuary of Eternal Grace, was more than a place of worship. It was the financial and social epicenter of the town, a sprawling campus of hope built by a man who preached prosperity and practiced what he preached. Pastor Wright, with his $1,000 suits and magnetic smile, was a pillar of the community, a man whose influence reached into every corner of the city's political and economic life. But behind the stained glass and soaring sermons, a darkness was festering, a greed so profound that it was about to curdle piety into poison. His partner in building this empire, the true architect of its community outreach and financial stability, was a woman named Ella Foster. She was the quiet, meticulous administrator who translated Wright's grand visions into workable realities, the one who managed the books, organized the charities, and ensured the ministry's vast network of businesses and investments ran smoothly. Ella Foster was more than just a business partner. She was a true believer, not only in God, but in Marcus Wright himself, having worked alongside him for nearly 2 decades. She had seen the ministry grow from a humble storefront church into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, and she had managed every dollar with unwavering integrity. It was this very integrity that became her death sentence, for in the quiet solitude of her office, late at night, she had begun to uncover a devastating truth. The numbers, once so clean and orderly, now told a story of systematic theft, a story of church funds being funneled into offshore accounts, of dummy corporations, and of a life of obscene luxury lived by the man she trusted most. For months, Pastor Wright had been embezzling millions of dollars, bleeding the very charity funds and tithing accounts that were meant to support the city's most vulnerable, all to finance a secret life of private jets, lavish vacations, and high-stakes gambling that stood in blasphemous contrast to the humble life he preached from the pulpit. The confrontation was inevitable, and Ella, a woman of deep moral conviction, prepared for it with a heavy heart, gathering spreadsheets and bank statements that formed an undeniable map of his betrayal. She scheduled a meeting with the church's board of directors, intending to expose the full scope of the fraud and remove the man she had once considered a brother in faith. She gave him one final chance, meeting him in the sanctuary one rainy Tuesday evening, pleading with him to confess and repent, to return the money and save his soul, even if it meant destroying his reputation. But Pastor Wright's soul had long been sold, and in her earnest, tearful plea, he saw not a friend offering a path to redemption, but a threat that needed to be permanently silenced. He listened to her impassioned speech, his face a mask of feigned contrition, all while the cold calculus of self-preservation solidified into a murderous resolve. That night, under the benevolent gaze of a towering crucifix, evil was done in the house of God. Marcus Wright, the shepherd of his flock, turned on one of his own, ensuring that Ella Foster's report would never reach the board. The act was one of calculated cruelty, a brutal and efficient silencing that left no room for doubt or mercy, the final, horrific transaction in a long history of spiritual and financial fraud. He murdered her not in a fit of rage, but with the chilling precision of a businessman closing a problematic account, disposing of the one person who could unravel his carefully constructed world. He then returned to his sprawling mansion on the edge of town, the blood of his partner on his hands, and prepared the sermon he would deliver the following Sunday, a sermon on the tragedy of unexpected loss and the mysterious ways of the Lord, confident that his holy image would be the only alibi he would ever need. He had built an empire on faith, and he was certain that the faith of his followers would shield him from the consequences of his ultimate sin. The following morning, a janitor discovered Ella Foster's body, and a single, horrified call to 911 shattered the peace of Northwood forever. The crime scene was a stark, brutal contrast to the serene environment of the sanctuary, a testament to the violence that had unfolded. Detectives who arrived on the scene were immediately struck by the sheer audacity of the murder committed in a place that was supposed to represent safety and sanctity. As the news spread, a wave of shock and disbelief washed over the congregation and the city at large. Pastor Marcus Wright was the first to be notified, and his performance was masterful. He wept. He raged against the heavens. He comforted Ella's grieving family, all while knowing he was the author of their pain. He spoke of a random act of violence, a robbery gone wrong, a tragic intrusion of the secular world's evils into their sacred space. The initial investigation was handled with a certain deference to the pastor, a man whose influence was palpable even among the police force, many of whom were members of his congregation. Lead Detective Joseph Clark, however, was a man immune to charisma, a seasoned investigator who believed that facts, not faith, solved murders. He listened patiently to Pastor Wright's tearful account of his last meeting with Ella, his story of leaving her working late in her office, a story delivered with the practiced cadence of a man used to holding an audience captive. But even in those early hours, Detective Clark sensed a dissonance, a subtle lack of genuine grief beneath the polished performance of a public mourner. He noted the way Wright's eyes never quite met his, the way his answers, though emotional, felt rehearsed and hollow. The detective knew that the truth of Ella Foster's death was not to be found in the pastor's sermons, but in the cold, hard evidence she had left behind. The first crack in Wright's holy facade appeared in Ella's office. On her computer, forensic analysts quickly uncovered the files she had been preparing for the board meeting, a meticulous and damning chronicle of financial malfeasance. The spreadsheets were a testament to her methodical nature, each line item a nail in the coffin of Marcus Wright's reputation. They detailed wire transfers to shell corporations, receipts for luxury goods purchased with charity funds, and a shadow ledger that tracked the pastor's secret expenditures. It was emotive, clean and powerful for a man who had everything to lose. The narrative of a random robbery began to evaporate under the harsh glare of financial data, replaced by the chilling possibility that Ella was killed not for the cash in her purse, but for the information on her hard drive. The investigation, which had started in the hallowed halls of the sanctuary, was now shifting its focus to the pastor's gilded cage. For weeks, Marcus Wright continued to preach, using his pulpit to mourn Ella and to call for justice, all while the net was tightening around him. He leveraged his considerable influence, calling press conferences to decry the slow pace of the investigation and to subtly cast suspicion on disgruntled former employees or shadowy business rivals. He was playing a dangerous game, using his public platform to control the narrative and paint himself as a fellow victim, a grieving shepherd whose flock had been violated. But Detective Clark and his team worked tirelessly in the background, building a mountain of evidence that contradicted the pastor's every word. They subpoenaed his personal bank records, tracked his movements through cell phone data, and began to interview members of his inner circle, slowly peeling back the layers of his saintly persona to reveal the calculating sinner beneath. The sermon of his innocence was growing thinner with each passing day, and the congregation was about to witness a reckoning of biblical proportions. The arrest of Pastor Marcus Wright was not a quiet affair. It was a spectacle, precisely as the pastor himself would have wanted, though not for the reasons he would have chosen. Detective Joseph Clark, armed with an ironclad warrant backed by a mountain of financial forensics, chose to apprehend him not at his home in the dead of night, but in the light of day in the parking lot of the Sanctuary of Eternal Grace. The pastor had just concluded a televised press conference in which he had, with performative tears in his eyes, announced the creation of a charitable foundation in Ella Foster's name. As the cameras were packing up, 2 unmarked police cars boxed in his luxury sedan, and Detective Clark approached the driver's side window, the arrest warrant held firmly in his hand. The moment was a collision of 2 worlds, the pastor's carefully curated reality of piety and power and the unyielding reality of the law. From the instant Detective Clark read him his rights, Marcus Wright's demeanor transformed, the mask of the grieving shepherd melting away to reveal the arrogant narcissist beneath. There was no shock, no fear, only a flicker of annoyance, as if he were being inconvenienced by a minor bureaucratic hurdle. He smirked at the detective, a look of profound condescension on his face, and held out his wrists for the handcuffs, as if presenting them for a new watch. He refused to walk, forcing the officers to guide him to the patrol car, all while he stared directly into the lens of a lingering news camera, a silent, defiant challenge to the city that had once adored him. The image was electric, broadcast across every local news channel within the hour, the man of God in handcuffs, his expression not one of shame, but of supreme, unshakable confidence. The interrogation that followed was a masterclass in psychological deflection and narcissistic control. In the sterile gray interview room, Marcus Wright was not a suspect. He was a king holding court. He leaned back in his chair, a picture of casual disdain, and treated the detective's questions as tiresome and beneath his intellect. When presented with the evidence of his embezzlement, the spreadsheets and bank statements that Ella Foster had died to protect, he simply waved a dismissive hand. "Fanciful theories," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "Ella, bless her soul, was a wonderful woman, but she was under a great deal of stress. Her accounting, in recent months, had become creative. I was trying to help her sort it out." He offered no proof, no counter-narrative, just a blanket denial wrapped in a cloak of condescending pity for his victim. Throughout the hours-long interview, Wright never once broke character. He was the bluffer, the high-stakes gambler who believed his hand was so strong he didn't even need to look at the cards. He deflected every question with a parable, a snippet of scripture twisted to serve his own ends, or a direct challenge to the detective's competence. "You gentlemen are chasing shadows," he told them, a thin smile playing on his lips. "While you're busy with these creative accounting theories, the real monster, the person who took that sweet woman from us, is still out there. I pray you find him before he hurts someone else." It was a breathtaking performance of gaslighting and projection, an attempt to use the very language of faith to shield himself from the earthly consequences of his sins. He was daring them to prove their case, confident that his reputation, his wealth, and his army of high-priced lawyers would render their evidence meaningless. Detective Clark, a man of quiet patience, simply let him talk, recognizing the pastor's hubris as a critical weakness. He and his partner presented document after document, each one a piece of the puzzle that formed a complete picture of his guilt. They showed him phone records that placed him at the church at the time of the murder, contradicting his alibi that he had gone straight home. They showed him security footage from a nearby ATM, time-stamped just 2 hours after the murder, showing a large cash withdrawal from an account linked to one of his shell corporations. With each piece of evidence, Wright's denials grew more grandiose, his tone more dismissive. He was not just denying the crime, he was denying reality itself, attempting to build a fortress of lies so thick that the truth could never penetrate it. The interrogation ended not with a confession but with a declaration of war. Wright stood up, smoothed the lapels of his suit jacket, and looked Detective Clark directly in the eye. "You have made a grave mistake, Detective," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "You have mistaken a man of God for a common criminal, and there will be a reckoning. My lawyers will dismantle this. This fantasy you've constructed piece by piece. By the time this is over, you will be the one on trial for malicious prosecution." It was a threat, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. He believed he was untouchable, a chosen one operating under a different set of rules, and as he was led to his holding cell, he was already planning his defense, a strategy built not on innocence, but on the power of influence and the art of intimidation. The news of his arrest and his defiant denial sent a seismic shock through the community. His congregation was split, with a core of fervent believers refusing to accept his guilt, seeing the arrest as a form of persecution, a test of their faith. They held vigils outside the police station, their signs proclaiming his innocence and condemning the secular authorities. But for others, the financial evidence was too damning to ignore. Lifelong members of the church began to question decades of blind faith, wondering if the man they had trusted with their souls had been a con artist all along. The city of Northwood was no longer united in its admiration for Pastor Wright. It was a community fractured by doubt and betrayal, the opening act of a legal drama that would expose a rot that went far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Marcus Wright's confidence was not unfounded. However, within hours, a team of the most expensive defense attorneys in the state descended upon the county jail, led by the legendary Charles Palmer, a lawyer famous for his theatrical courtroom style and his ability to win unwinnable cases. Palmer immediately held a press conference on the courthouse steps, echoing his client's claims of a witch hunt and a shoddy investigation. He promised to expose the so-called evidence for what it was, the misinterpretations of a grieving and unstable employee twisted by an overzealous police department. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, Detective Clark and the prosecutor's office, armed with a mountain of forensic data. On the other, Pastor Marcus Wright and his legal dream team, armed with immense wealth, public influence, and an unshakable belief in their own divine right to be above the law. As Prosecutor Victoria Evans and Detective Joseph Clark began to build their case for trial, they knew that the financial records and circumstantial evidence, while strong, might not be enough to overcome the formidable defense team being assembled by Marcus Wright. They needed something more, something that would strip away the pastor's carefully constructed veneer of respectability and expose the true nature of the man to a jury. The investigation turned from the pastor's financial life to his personal history, a deep dive into the decades he had spent building his empire. They interviewed former staff, estranged acquaintances, and anyone who had ever been part of his inner circle, hoping to find a crack in the fortress of loyalty and fear that surrounded him. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, an anonymous tip, a whispered call from a payphone that pointed them toward a sealed juvenile record in a neighboring state. What they uncovered was the first true glimpse of the monster hiding behind the clerical collar. Decades earlier, long before he had found God and founded his ministry, a teenage Marcus Wright had been arrested for a shockingly violent assault on a high school classmate who had beaten him for a spot on the varsity basketball team. The attack was brutal and premeditated, leaving the other boy with permanent injuries. The record showed a pattern of intimidation, of witness tampering, and of a family that used its considerable wealth and influence to make the problem disappear. The charges were quietly dropped, the record sealed, and the incident was buried under the weight of money and power. The victim's family had been forced to move away, their silence purchased with a hefty settlement and a non-disclosure agreement that had been ruthlessly enforced for over 30 years. This discovery was more than just a piece of prior bad act evidence, it was the blueprint for the murder of Ella Foster. It demonstrated a lifelong pattern. When faced with a threat to his status or ambition, Marcus Wright's response was not negotiation or compromise, but overwhelming and decisive violence. It also revealed the complicity of his family, a powerful and wealthy dynasty that had always been there to clean up his messes, to bury his secrets, and to ensure that he never had to face the consequences of his actions. The family, led by his formidable and controlling mother, had always operated as a unit, a tight-knit clan that valued its reputation above all else, even the rule of law. They were the original enablers, the ones who had taught him that his desires were paramount and that any obstacle, human or otherwise, could be removed with sufficient application of wealth and power. The prosecution team now had a new explosive angle to pursue. They began to re-interview former church elders and staff members who had left the ministry under mysterious circumstances over the years. This time, armed with the knowledge of the family's methods, they pushed harder, offering immunity and protection. A former church elder finally broke down, confessing that he had been forced out years earlier after questioning some of the pastor's financial dealings. He described how Wright's older brothers, both influential figures in their own right, had paid him a visit, subtly threatening his family and his business if he did not resign quietly. He had been given a generous severance package, a blessing as they had called it, which he knew was nothing more than hush money. His story was a chilling echo of the past, proof that the family's tactics had not changed. They had merely been refined and sanctified under the cover of the church. The evidence of the family's cover-up was the twist that transformed the case. It was no longer just about one man's greed. It was about a generational conspiracy to protect a predator, to nurture his narcissism, and to insulate him from accountability. Prosecutor Evans realized that Marcus Wright was not just a product of his own evil, but the perfected creation of a family that had been covering up his violence for his entire life. They were the ones who had helped him build the very persona he now used as a shield. They had paid for his seminary education, financed the launch of his first church, and used their connections to grease the wheels of his success, all while knowing the darkness that lurked within him. Their financial and emotional investment in his success was so complete that they had no choice but to protect him, because his downfall meant their own. This new evidence allowed the prosecution to paint a far more terrifying picture for the jury. Marcus Wright wasn't just a pastor who had succumbed to temptation, he was a lifelong predator who had been expertly managed and repeatedly unleashed by a family that saw him as their greatest asset. They had helped him create the perfect disguise, a cloak of holiness that allowed him to operate with impunity. The murder of Ella Foster was not an aberration, it was the logical culmination of a life lived without consequences, the final bloody act of a man who had been taught from a young age that he was above reproach. The family's complicity became a central pillar of the prosecution's strategy, a way to show the jury that the arrogance and defiance they saw in the courtroom were not recent developments, but a deeply ingrained part of his character, nurtured and protected for decades. The defense team was blindsided by the unsealing of the juvenile record. Charles Palmer had built his entire strategy around painting his client as a benevolent community leader, a man whose life was a testament to Christian virtue. This evidence of past violence and worse, of a family-wide cover-up, threatened to shatter that image completely. They filed motion after motion to have the evidence excluded, arguing that it was prejudicial and irrelevant to the current case. But the judge, after reviewing the clear parallels between the past and present crimes, ruled that it was admissible. It spoke directly to motive, intent, and a common scheme or plan. The courtroom was about to hear the secret history of Marcus Wright, a history his family had spent a fortune to keep buried. The weight of this new evidence also began to create fractures within the Wright family itself. While his mother and brothers remained staunchly defiant in public, investigators began to pick up whispers of internal strife. A younger cousin, who had been ostracized from the family years earlier, agreed to speak with detectives. He described a family dynamic ruled by fear, a place where Marcus was the golden child who could do no wrong, and anyone who questioned him was cast out. He painted a portrait of a matriarch who was obsessed with power and public perception, a woman who would sacrifice anyone, even another family member, to protect her favored son. The fortress was beginning to crumble from within, and the trial hadn't even started yet. The truth, buried for so long, was finally clawing its way into the light. In the weeks leading up to the trial, the courtroom became a theater for Marcus Wright's staggering arrogance, a stage where he performed his contempt for the proceedings with a series of calculated, insulting gestures. His defense team, led by the increasingly exasperated Charles Palmer, advised him to adopt a somber, respectful demeanor to project the image of a man wrongfully accused but respectful of the legal process. Wright, however, had no intention of playing the part of the humble servant of the law. He saw the trial not as a legal jeopardy, but as an affront to his authority, and he was determined to treat it with the disdain he felt it deserved. He was a master of the subtle, infuriating act of psychological warfare, and he used every pretrial hearing to mock the system that dared to hold him accountable. The most shocking moment came during a routine motions hearing, a dry, technical affair that was nonetheless being covered by the local media. As the prosecutor, Victoria Evans, argued for the inclusion of a particularly damning piece of financial evidence, Wright leaned over to his attorney, Charles Palmer. Unaware that the courtroom's new high-sensitivity microphones were active and recording everything, he whispered a cruel, depraved joke about Ella Foster's death. His exact words were a sickening pun on her name and the manner of her murder, a comment so vile and heartless that it defied belief. The whisper, amplified by the courtroom's audio system, was broadcast live to the news cameras in the back and recorded for the official court record. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by a stunned, horrified silence. The hot mic moment was a catastrophic, self-inflicted wound. In that single, whispered sentence, Marcus Wright had revealed the absolute void where his soul was supposed to be. The mask of the grieving friend and pastor was incinerated, replaced by the sneering face of a monster who found his own brutal crime amusing. Victoria Evans stopped her argument mid-sentence, her face a mask of cold fury. The judge, visibly shaken, immediately called a recess, his voice trembling with rage as he ordered the bailiffs to clear the courtroom. Charles Palmer sank into his chair, his head in his hands, the color drained from his face. He was a brilliant lawyer, but even he could not craft a defense for that kind of pure, unadulterated evil, captured for the entire world to hear. It was a confession of character, more damning than any signature on a document. This incident set the tone for all of Wright's subsequent courtroom behavior. He seemed to delight in tormenting the prosecution, and most cruelly, the family of Ella Foster, who sat in the front row of the gallery every day, their faces etched with grief. He would stare at them, a faint, knowing smirk on his lips. He would feign sleep during procedural arguments, letting out a loud theatrical snore at one point. He treated his own defense team with open contempt, rolling his eyes at their legal strategies and often interrupting Charles Palmer to offer his own, usually disastrous, legal opinions. He was not a client, he was a director, and he was determined to run the show, turning the solemn process of justice into a circus of his own making. His family, meanwhile, launched a parallel war in the court of public opinion. They hired a high-powered public relations firm to orchestrate a smear campaign against Ella Foster. They leaked fabricated stories to tabloid websites, suggesting she had a secret gambling problem or was involved with shady characters, desperately trying to create an alternative narrative that might explain her death. They painted their son as the victim of a vindictive employee who, upon being discovered for her own financial misdeeds, had perhaps fallen afoul of dangerous people. It was a disgusting and transparent strategy, an attempt to desecrate the memory of the woman he had murdered to save himself. The family's full-throated defense, even after the hot mic incident, was a chilling display of their shared pathology, a testament to their absolute belief that their wealth and status entitled them to create their own reality. The prosecution, while publicly decrying Wright's behavior, recognized it as a gift. Every smirk, every whispered joke, every act of disrespect was another nail in his coffin. Victoria Evans instructed her team to meticulously document every instance of his contemptuous behavior, preparing to use his own courtroom conduct as evidence of his remorselessness and his consciousness of guilt. He was in effect becoming the prosecution's star witness against himself. His need to dominate and mock every person in the room overrode any instinct for self-preservation. He was so convinced of his own untouchability that he could not see that his performance was not intimidating, but deeply and irrevocably damning. The psychological profile that emerged was that of a malignant narcissist, a man incapable of empathy for whom other people were merely objects to be used, manipulated, or discarded. The trial was the ultimate stage for his personality disorder. It provided him with an audience, a conflict, and a set of rules he could delight in breaking. His cruelty was not a bug in his strategy, it was the entire point. He wanted to demonstrate his power, to show the world that even when he was shackled and on trial for his life, he was still the one in control. He believed that by showing no fear and no remorse, he would project an aura of innocence, when in fact he was projecting an aura of pure sociopathy that was plain for everyone, especially the potential jury pool, to see. As jury selection approached, the challenge for the defense became almost insurmountable. How could they find 12 citizens in Northwood who had not heard the hot mic recording, who had not seen the endless news clips of the smirking pastor, who had not read the salacious stories planted by his family? Charles Palmer argued for a change of venue, claiming that his client could not possibly receive a fair trial in a city that had been so thoroughly saturated with prejudicial publicity. The judge denied the motion, dryly pointing out that much of that publicity had been generated by the defendant himself. Marcus Wright would face a jury of his peers, a jury of people from the very community he had betrayed, who had now been given a front-row seat to the darkness he had hidden for so long. The first day of the trial of Pastor Marcus Wright was a media spectacle, with satellite trucks lining the streets and crowds of protesters and supporters creating a tense, volatile atmosphere outside the courthouse. Inside, the courtroom was packed, a silent, anxious audience ready to witness the fall of a titan. Marcus Wright made his entrance not with the bowed head of a humble defendant, but with the confident stride of a celebrity arriving on a red carpet. He smiled and nodded at his supporters in the gallery, a king acknowledging his loyal subjects, before taking his seat next to a grim-faced Charles Palmer. His suit was impeccably tailored, his demeanor calm and collected, but his eyes held a glint of predatory excitement. This was his stage now, and he was ready to perform. The prosecution, led by Victoria Evans, began its opening statement with a move that was both poignant and devastatingly effective. She did not start with the details of the crime or the mountain of financial evidence. Instead, she walked to a large monitor set up facing the jury box and played a short, simple video. It was from Ella Foster's cell phone, taken just 1 month before her murder. In it, she was laughing, surrounded by children at the dedication of a new wing of the local hospital, a project she had personally overseen and funded through the church's charitable foundation. The video was less than a minute long, but it filled the courtroom with the sound of her joy and the image of her vibrant, hopeful face. When the video ended, Evans let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, the ghost of Ella Foster's goodness palpable in the room, before she turned to the jury and said, "That is the woman Marcus Wright murdered." Then came the bombshell. Victoria Evans, in a clear, measured voice, proceeded to lay out the prosecution's case, starting not with the embezzlement, but with a shocking revelation that had been kept under wraps until that moment. "The evidence will show," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction, "that Marcus Wright did not just murder Ella Foster to cover up his theft. The evidence will show that 24 hours before she was killed, Ella Foster discovered a second set of secret accounts, a second layer of fraud, far more monstrous than the first. She discovered that for over a decade, Marcus Wright had been systematically stealing from the church's fund for victims of domestic abuse, a fund he himself had established in the name of his own deceased sister. The revelation landed like a physical blow. The courtroom erupted in gasps, and even Wright's own mother, seated in the front row, looked visibly stunned. This was the masterstroke of the prosecution's strategy. They had uncovered this second, more heinous theft late in their investigation, a fund that Wright had used as a personal slush fund while publicly positioning himself as a champion for abused women. It was a betrayal so profound, so deeply cynical, that it transcended mere financial greed and entered the realm of pure evil. It recontextualized the entire crime, showing that Ella's murder was not just about protecting his wealth, but about protecting his most sacred and fraudulent public image. The pastor who preached charity and protection for the vulnerable was in fact preying on them, stealing the very money meant to help them escape their abusers. The jury stared at Marcus Wright, their expressions shifting from curiosity to revulsion. As Evans detailed the evidence they would present, the secret ledgers, the testimony of a woman from the shelter who had been denied funds, the trail of money leading to a luxury car purchase made on the same day a family was turned away, Marcus Wright's composure finally began to crack. A muscle twitched in his jaw. His confident smile faltered, replaced by a tight, venomous glare directed at the prosecutor. He leaned over to Charles Palmer and hissed, "How did they find that?" Loud enough for those in the jury box to hear. It was not the question of an innocent man. It was the question of a guilty man whose deepest, darkest secret had just been exposed to the world. His arrogance had, for a moment, been supplanted by a flash of pure, panicked fury. The defense's opening statement, which was supposed to portray Wright as the victim of a conspiracy, was left in tatters before Charles Palmer even reached the podium. He now had to contend not only with a murder charge and an embezzlement charge, but with the public revelation that his client was a moral monster of the highest order. Palmer did his best, attempting to dismiss the new allegations as a desperate, last-minute fabrication by the prosecution, but his words rang hollow. The damage was done. The jury was no longer looking at a beloved pastor accused of a crime. They were looking at a man who smiled for the cameras at a domestic violence shelter while simultaneously stealing the money meant to buy a bus ticket for a battered woman and her children. The rest of the day was a parade of the prosecution's foundational evidence, with the first witnesses being the forensic accountants who had followed the money trail. They walked the jury through the complex web of shell corporations and offshore accounts with painstaking, methodical detail. With each new document presented, each new transfer of funds highlighted on the screen, the scale of Wright's greed became more and more apparent. He had not just stolen, he had plundered, taking from every charitable endeavor the church had ever established. The sheer volume of his theft was staggering, dwarfing the initial estimates and painting a portrait of a man with an insatiable appetite for wealth and a chilling disregard for the people he claimed to serve. By the end of the first day, the image of Pastor Wright as a pillar of the community had been systematically dismantled and replaced with the image of a ravenous wolf who had been feasting on his own flock for years. The second week of the trial brought a technological witness into the courtroom, one that could not be intimidated, cross-examined, or accused of having a personal vendetta. Prosecutor Victoria Evans called to the stand a digital forensics expert, a man who had analyzed the contents of every electronic device seized from Ella Foster's office and the church sanctuary. The expert testified about a small, unassuming smart speaker that had been on the corner of Ella's desk, a gift from her niece. He explained that these devices, in order to respond to a wake word, are constantly listening in short, buffered loops. And on the night of the murder, through a fluke of timing and acoustics, the device had been activated in the moments leading up to Ella's death. The courtroom fell into a heavy, anticipatory silence as Evans asked the clerk to play the recovered audio file. What came out of the courtroom speakers was the sound of raw, unvarnished evil. The recording was short, less than 45 seconds, but it was a lifetime. It began with Ella's voice, pleading and desperate. "Marcus, please," she could be heard saying, her words choked with tears. "We can fix this. You can return the money. Don't throw your life away. Don't throw everything we built away." There was a pause, and then Marcus Wright's voice, not the booming, charismatic baritone from the pulpit, but a flat, cold, dead thing, stripped of all artifice. "You're right, Ella," he said, his tone chillingly calm. "We can't let you throw it all away." The final sounds on the recording were a sharp, muffled cry from Ella, the sound of a struggle, and then an abrupt, horrifying silence. The audio recording was the murder weapon, the confession, and the victim's final testimony, all rolled into one. It was an irrefutable, real-time dispatch from the moment of the crime, capturing the victim's last plea and the perpetrator's cold, cruel voice as he passed his own judgment. Ella's mother, Claire Foster, let out a gut-wrenching sob that seemed to tear through the fabric of the room, and she collapsed into the arms of her husband. Several jurors gasped, their hands flying to their mouths, while others simply stared at the defendant, their faces pale with shock and horror. The recording did more than just place Marcus Wright at the scene. It placed his soulless intent on full display. It was the voice of a man, not losing control, but exercising it in the most absolute and final way imaginable. Marcus Wright's reaction was perhaps the most damning part of all. As the horrific sounds of his crime echoed through the courtroom, he showed no emotion. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He simply sat at the defense table, his hands calmly folded, and stared directly at the jury, his expression a blank mask of detached curiosity, as if he were listening to a weather report. This utter lack of a human reaction, this profound emotional void in the face of his own monstrosity, was a silent confession of his character. It told the jury everything they needed to know about the man behind the holy robes. He was not just a killer. He was a sociopath, a man for whom the murder of a lifelong friend was an event so insignificant it barely registered on an emotional level. Charles Palmer's defense was shattered. There was no way to spin the recording, no legal loophole to exploit. He couldn't claim the voice wasn't his client's. It was as recognizable as a fingerprint. He couldn't claim the context was ambiguous. It was the sound of a murder. His only recourse was to feebly object, claiming the recording was an illegal wiretap, an argument the judge swiftly overruled, noting that there is no expectation of privacy when committing a felony. The smart speaker, a simple piece of consumer electronics, had become the prosecution's star witness, a silent, impartial observer that had borne witness to the truth and delivered it, cold and unvarnished, into the heart of the trial. The presentation of the audio recording marked the turning point of the trial. Before it, the case was a complex puzzle of financial records and circumstantial links. After that, the case was simple. The jury had heard Marcus Wright's guilt with their own ears. They had heard the final, desperate moments of Ella Foster's life. The rest of the trial from that moment on felt like a formality, a procedural march toward a verdict that now seemed all but inevitable. The question was no longer whether Marcus Wright was guilty, but how he could possibly have believed he would ever get away with it. The recording provided the answer. He was a man so consumed by his own narcissism that he had become deaf to the sounds of his own depravity. The impact on the community was immediate and profound. The last vestiges of support for the pastor evaporated overnight. The vigils outside the courthouse disappeared, replaced by crowds demanding justice for Ella. Members of his congregation, who had clung to the hope of his innocence, were forced to confront the horrifying truth. The sanctuary of eternal grace, once a symbol of hope, was now tainted, a monument to a terrible deception. The audio recording was played on every news channel, a haunting loop of betrayal that became the soundtrack to the city's collective disillusionment. The shepherd had been exposed as the wolf, and the flock was finally seeing him for what he truly was. The smart speaker had not only recorded a murder, it had recorded the death of a lie that an entire community had been told for 2 decades. With the prosecution's case appearing unassailable after the revelation of the smart speaker recording, the defense was left with a desperate high-risk strategy. Charles Palmer had to create a narrative of reasonable doubt, however slim, and his only hope was to put forward a credible alibi witness, someone who could place Marcus Wright far from the church at the time of the murder. Their star witness was Stephen Cooper, Pastor Wright's cousin and the longtime head of security for the church. Cooper was a man whose loyalty to Marcus was legendary, a quiet, imposing figure who was always by the pastor's side. He was prepared to testify under oath that he and Marcus had been in a late-night meeting in the pastor's home office at the exact time Ella Foster was killed, reviewing security protocols for an upcoming charity event. Stephen Cooper took the stand with an air of quiet confidence. He was well rehearsed, his story detailed and consistent. He spoke of specific documents they had reviewed, of a phone call he had made to a vendor, of the exact time the pastor had walked him to the door. Under direct examination from Charles Palmer, he was a perfect witness, his testimony a solid block of granite pushed directly into the path of the prosecution's timeline. He was calm, he was precise, and he was believable. Marcus Wright watched him from the defense table, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. This was the power of loyalty, the power of family. This was the story that would save him. However, Prosecutor Victoria Evans had been anticipating this. Her team had done a deep dive into Stephen Cooper's life, and they had found a loose thread. During her cross-examination, she began not by attacking his story, but by asking about his daughter's rare and debilitating medical condition. She asked about the experimental treatments, the expensive medications, the crushing weight of medical bills that had been piling up for years. Cooper's confident demeanor began to falter, a flicker of anxiety in his eyes. He answered her questions reluctantly, his voice losing its steady rhythm. The jury leaned forward, sensing a shift in the courtroom's energy. Evans was not just questioning a witness, she was carefully and methodically dismantling a man. Then Evans played her trump card. "Mr. Cooper," she said, her voice laced with quiet sympathy, "is it not true that for the past 3 years an anonymous benefactor has been paying 100% of your daughter's medical expenses, depositing exactly $52,000 into a special account on the 1st of every month?" Cooper froze, his face ashen. He stammered, denying any knowledge of it. Evans then projected a series of bank statements onto the courtroom monitors. They were from a bank in the Cayman Islands, the same bank used for one of Pastor Wright's primary shell corporations. The statements showed a recurring monthly transfer of $52,000 from that shell corporation into the medical trust fund set up for Cooper's daughter. The paper trail was undeniable. The courtroom was silent, the only sound the quiet hum of the monitors displaying the evidence of the bribe. Victoria Evans approached the witness stand, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Mr. Cooper," she said, "that is not the salary of a head of church security. That is the price of your silence. That is the money Marcus Wright has been paying you, not just to provide him with a false alibi for murder, but for your help in his crimes. Isn't that right?" She let the question hang in the air, the weight of it pressing down on him. Stephen Cooper looked from the bank statements to his cousin, Pastor Wright, whose face was now a mask of pure fury. In that moment, he saw not a beloved family member, but the man who had bought his soul and was now willing to watch him commit perjury and be destroyed for it. In a stunning, dramatic collapse, the defense's star alibi witness crumbled. Stephen Cooper broke down on the stand, his body shaking with convulsive sobs. Through his tears, he confessed everything. He admitted the alibi was a complete fabrication, a story he and Marcus had concocted the day after the murder. He admitted that the monthly payments were hush money, a reward for his years of looking the other way as Marcus embezzled millions. And then he confessed something even more horrifying. He admitted that Marcus had threatened his daughter, subtly hinting that the life-saving medical payments would stop if he ever refused to cooperate. He had been trapped, forced to choose between the truth and his child's life. The alibi witness had not just crumbled, he had detonated, and the explosion ripped through the last vestiges of Marcus Wright's defense, exposing him as a man who would not only kill to protect his secrets, but would leverage a sick child's life to secure his freedom. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the defense. The jury had just witnessed a man confess to being blackmailed into perjury by the defendant. The confession explained not only the false alibi but also provided a chilling insight into Wright's methods of control, showing how he used his stolen wealth to create a network of dependent and terrified accomplices. Charles Palmer's face was a study in defeat. His star witness had just confessed to multiple felonies on the stand and had implicated his client in witness tampering, blackmail, and conspiracy. There was nothing left to defend. The narrative of reasonable doubt had been obliterated, replaced by the certainty of a vast criminal conspiracy orchestrated by the man in the $1,000 suit. Marcus Wright, for the first time, looked truly panicked, his mask of arrogant detachment shattered by the public betrayal of the man he thought he owned. The trial had become a relentless onslaught against Marcus Wright's character, with each day bringing a new revelation of his depravity. Yet through it all, he had maintained a veneer of defiant indifference, his courtroom demeanor a constant, silent insult to the proceedings. He smirked during testimony about the victim, he rolled his eyes at the prosecutor, and he treated the entire process as a personal annoyance. This calculated disrespect, this refusal to acknowledge the gravity of his situation or the sanctity of the courtroom, had been steadily grating on the judge, a veteran jurist known for his stern demeanor and his low tolerance for theatrical antics. The breaking point came during the victim impact statements, a moment that should have been defined by solemnity and grief, but which Marcus Wright decided to treat as an opportunity for one final public act of contempt. Ella Foster's elderly mother, Claire Foster, a woman of profound dignity and quiet faith, took the stand. Her voice was soft but steady as she spoke of her daughter not as a victim but as a vibrant, loving woman whose life had been a source of light for everyone she knew. She did not address the court or the jury, but spoke directly to Marcus Wright. She described how Ella had looked up to him, how she had believed in his mission, and how she had defended him against any and all critics. "She loved you, Marcus," the old woman said, her voice breaking for the first time. "She believed you were a man of God, and you repaid her faith with betrayal and her love with murder. I have only one question for you. Why?" As she spoke, her words filled with a grief so immense it was almost a physical presence in the room. Marcus Wright yawned. It was not a subtle, stifled yawn. It was a loud, deliberate, jaw-stretching yawn of theatrical boredom. The act was so shocking, so profoundly disrespectful, that a wave of audible gasps swept through the courtroom. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated contempt, a final spit-in-the-face insult to a grieving mother pouring out her soul. That was the moment the judge finally snapped. He slammed his gavel down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot, his face a thunderous mask of fury. "That is enough," he roared, his voice booming through the silent courtroom. He ordered the jury to be removed, and once the door to the jury room was closed, he rose to his full height, his black robes billowing, and fixed Marcus Wright with a stare of pure, unmitigated judicial rage. The room held its breath. This was no longer just a trial. It was a raw confrontation between law and lawlessness, between order and chaos. "Mr. Wright," the judge began, his voice dangerously low, "for weeks you have sat in this courtroom, a place where justice is sought and truth is honored, and you have treated it as your personal playground. You have mocked the witnesses, you have disrespected the attorneys, and you have shown a level of contempt for the sanctity of these proceedings that I have not witnessed in my 34 years on this bench. But to sit there and mock a grieving mother as she speaks of her murdered child is a transgression so profoundly monstrous, so utterly devoid of basic human decency, that it demands a response." The judge's words were not just a reprimand, they were a condemnation, a verbal stripping away of any pretense that Marcus Wright was anything other than a cancer in the room. The judge continued, his voice rising with each word, his fury palpable. "You may believe that your wealth and your title place you above the rules that govern the rest of humanity, but you are mistaken. In this room you are not a pastor, you are not a community leader, you are not a man of influence, You are a defendant, accused of the most heinous crime a human being can commit, and you will show this court and the memory of the woman you are accused of killing the respect they are owed." He then sentenced Wright to 48 hours in solitary confinement for contempt of court to be served immediately, an unprecedented move in the middle of a murder trial. He wanted to make it clear to Wright and to the world that there were still consequences, that there were still lines that could not be crossed, even by a man who believed he was a god. The bailiffs moved in, and for the first time, Marcus Wright's composure shattered completely. The public humiliation, the direct challenge to his authority from the one person in the room whose power superseded his own, was too much for his narcissistic ego to bear. He began to scream, a torrent of profanity and threats, railing against the judge, the jury, and the system. It was an ugly, pathetic tantrum, the desperate rage of a tyrant who had finally been checked. As he was physically dragged from the courtroom, still screaming, the last vestiges of his holy image were left in a heap on the floor. The jury had been removed, but the entire gallery, the press, and the victim's family had seen it all. They had seen the breaking point, not just of the judge, but of the defendant himself, the moment his mask of cool disdain was ripped away to reveal the shrieking, impotent monster beneath. The trial was, for all intents and purposes, over. All that remained was the final verdict and the sentencing of a man who had just proven, beyond any doubt, that he was utterly and irredeemably lost. When the trial resumed 2 days later, Marcus Wright was a changed man. His time in solitary confinement had not humbled him. It had hardened his fury into a cold, simmering resentment. He returned to the courtroom with a look of pure hatred in his eyes, his defiance now stripped of its theatricality and replaced with something far more menacing. But the prosecution had one final, devastating witness to call, a witness who would not only seal Wright's fate but would redefine the entire scope of his evil. That witness was Stephen Cooper, the disgraced head of security who had been brought back from custody after agreeing to a plea deal in exchange for his full and truthful testimony. What he had to offer was far more than a confession of a false alibi. It was the key that would unlock the door to Marcus Wright's secret life as a prolific, undetected predator. On the stand for the second time, Stephen Cooper was a broken man, his testimony delivered in a halting, shame-filled voice. He explained to the jury that his role had been far more than just looking the other way on financial matters. He had been Marcus Wright's fixer, the man who cleaned up his messes, silenced his accusers, and buried his secrets for nearly 15 years. And then, at Victoria Evans's prompting, he revealed the existence of a small digital audio recorder, a device he had started carrying a year ago when he realized the pastor was becoming more erratic and dangerous. He had begun to secretly record their private conversations, he explained through tears, to create an insurance policy for himself, something to protect his family if Marcus ever decided he was a liability. He then authenticated a recording he had given to the prosecution, made just 3 weeks before Ella Foster's murder. Victoria Evans played the tape. The quality was clear, the voices of Marcus Wright and Stephen Cooper unmistakable. On the recording, Wright was not discussing church business. He was bragging. He was recounting, in graphic and chilling detail, the murder of a young woman in a different state, a cold case that had remained unsolved for over a decade. He laughed as he described how he had lured the woman into his car, how he had taken her to a secluded spot, and how he had killed her simply for the thrill of it. She was a nobody. Wright's voice sneered on the tape. No one ever even looked for her. That's the key, Stephen. You pick the ones they won't miss. He then went on to describe his next target, a transient man in a neighboring city, casually planning another murder as if he were discussing a weekend trip. The secret recording was the final, horrifying revelation. Marcus Wright was not just a greedy pastor who had killed his business partner, he was a serial killer. He had been using his pastoral travels as a cover for a secret life of predatory violence, a life that had gone completely undetected for years. The murder of Ella Foster was not his first act of violence, but merely the first time he had been sloppy enough to kill someone people would look for, someone whose absence would be noticed. His arrogance, his confidence in his own untouchability, had finally led him to make a fatal mistake. The courtroom listened in stunned, horrified silence. The case had transformed from a single murder trial into the unmasking of one of the most cunning and prolific serial killers the state had ever seen. The recording provided the ultimate psychological key to Marcus Wright. It explained his complete lack of remorse, his casual cruelty, his utter disregard for human life. To him, people were not souls to be saved, but objects for his use and amusement, and their lives were his to take at his whim. The embezzlement, the fraud, the lavish lifestyle, it was all just part of the same pathology, a manifestation of a man who believed he was a god with the power of life and death in his hands. He had built his church, not as a house of worship, but as the perfect hunting blind, a respectable facade that gave him access to victims, the ability to travel without suspicion, and a river of untraceable cash to fund his dark desires. For the jury, the recording was the final, definitive proof of his monstrous nature. Any lingering microscopic doubt was vaporized. They had now heard, in his own voice, a confession to multiple murders, a boastful, proud declaration of his hidden life. They saw the man in the defendant's chair not just as the killer of Ella Foster, but as a plague, a predator who had moved among them for decades, cloaked in the sanctity of the church. The trial had become a public service, an act of civic hygiene that would remove a monster from their midst. As the recording ended, Marcus Wright did something no one expected. He began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle and grew into a full-throated maniacal laugh of pure nihilistic glee. The secret was out, the game was up, and he seemed to find it all incredibly amusing. His laughter was the final terrifying confession, an admission that he had played them all for fools for years. He laughed at the jury, he laughed at the judge, and he laughed at the memory of his victims. It was the sound of a man so completely disconnected from humanity that he could find humor in his own unmasking, a final performance of a monster reveling in his own evil as the curtain finally came down on his charade. The jury's deliberation was a mere formality, lasting only 23 minutes, just long enough to sign the paperwork. The verdict was guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, multiple counts of embezzlement, and conspiracy. When the foreman read the verdict, the courtroom erupted in a wave of raw emotion. Cries of relief and applause from the gallery mixed with the heartbroken sobs of Ella Foster's family, a cathartic release of tension that had been building for months. But Marcus Wright showed no reaction. He simply stood, his face a placid mask, and stared blankly ahead as his life's work of deception was officially and finally condemned. There was no more laughter, no more smirking, just the empty, hollow gaze of a man whose soul had been vacant for a very long time. At the sentencing hearing a week later, Marcus Wright was given the opportunity to make a final statement. The courtroom expected a plea for mercy, a desperate last-ditch attempt at remorse, or perhaps another defiant denial. He offered none of those. Instead, when the judge asked if he had anything to say, he stood, cleared his throat, and looked not at the judge, but at the gallery, at the news cameras, at the world. And then, in a calm, conversational tone, he began to confess. Not just to the murder of Ella Foster or the woman on the secret recording, but to others. There was the hitchhiker in '98 outside of Reno, he began, a small, chilling smile playing on his lips. And the gas station clerk in Florida, I think that was 2005. No one ever connected them. They never would have. It was a final shocking outburst of pure, unadulterated ego. He was not confessing out of remorse, he was confessing out of pride. He was a collector showing off his prized acquisitions, a master artist signing his hidden works. With the whole world watching, he turned his own sentencing into the beginning of a dozen new investigations, casually dropping names, dates, and locations of unsolved murders that had haunted law enforcement agencies across the country for years. He was taking a final twisted victory lap, ensuring that his legacy would not be that of a disgraced pastor, but of a criminal mastermind, a monster whose true scope was only now being understood. He was erasing Marcus Wright, the man of God, and cementing the legend of Marcus Wright, the serial killer. The courtroom was thrown into chaos. Detectives from other jurisdictions, who had attended the trial on a hunch, were scrambling, making frantic calls. The judge repeatedly banged his gavel, trying to regain control, but Wright would not be silenced. He continued his litany of death, a horrifying travelogue of his secret life, each confession another stab in the heart of the families who had waited years for answers. It was his ultimate act of control, a final, sadistic performance where he held all the power, doling out pieces of long sought-after information as if they were party favors. He was not being sentenced. He was holding one last horrifying sermon from a pulpit of pure evil. Finally, the judge managed to silence him, ordering the bailiffs to restrain him. The judge, his face pale with fury and disgust, then delivered his sentence. He dispensed with the usual legal formalities and spoke directly to the man before him. "You are a predator who wrapped himself in the flag of piety, a cancer that metastasized in the heart of a trusting community," the judge said, his voice shaking with righteous anger. "You used faith as a weapon and charity as a disguise. This court cannot sentence you for all the lives you have destroyed, but it can ensure that you will never again have the opportunity to harm another living soul." He then sentenced Marcus Wright to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Ella Foster, with additional consecutive life sentences for each of the other murders he had just confessed to, ensuring he would die in a cage. As the bailiffs dragged him from the courtroom for the last time, a wailing, screaming Marcus Wright had one final message. He spat at the prosecution table and screamed a threat at Detective Clark and Victoria Evans, a final, impotent burst of rage from a king who had been permanently dethroned. The doors closed behind him, and a profound, exhausted silence fell over the courtroom. Justice had been served for Ella Foster, but a new, terrible chapter had just begun for the families of the victims he had named. In his final act, Marcus Wright had ensured that his reign of terror would continue, his shadow stretching out from his prison cell to cast a pall over countless lives for years to come. The man of God was gone, but the monster he had created would haunt them forever.